There are chapters of history too disturbing for textbooks, moments whispered rather than spoken, stories buried beneath soil soaked with suffering. Sometimes the past claws its way back, demanding to be remembered, not as a date or a lesson, but as a chilling echo that refuses to fade. Tonight, you will hear one of those stories. A tale where fear and cruelty walked hand in hand, where a single life marked by difference became a curse to those who tried to possess it. He was born on a night when the winds refused to blow, as if even nature itself was holding its breath. The women in the slave quarters whispered that the sky looked pale that evening, drained of color, like the child that would soon arrive. His mother, exhausted from the labor forced upon her body long before she ever carried him, knew that this birth was not like the others. The air felt heavy, and the cries of other newborns from her past pregnancies never sounded like this. When he finally came into the world, every candle flickered as though pulled toward him, and the midwife took a step back, her eyes widening, unable to mask the fear that spread across her face. The child had skin white as winter frost, hair like moonlit cotton, and eyes that glowed in the dimness with a color no one could name. The mother did not scream, but her heart did. She knew in a place deeper than thought that his arrival meant change, and change on a plantation rarely meant anything but suffering. Rumors spread before the sun even rose the next morning. They traveled from lip to lip, carried by the trembling breath of those who had seen him. Some said he was a sign from God, others a warning. Some believed he was born cursed, touched by forces that had no place among the living. And those who feared the unknown reached for belief as their only defense, because belief is easier than facing a truth too strange to comprehend. None of them asked what he would grow to become, only what he already was. A curiosity, a threat, a reminder that even in places meant to be controlled, the world still held power no man could tame. The master of the plantation, a man known more for his pride than his humanity, heard the whispers like distant thunder. At first he laughed at the thought of a child altering the order of his world. But when the boy was brought before him, something shifted in his expression. He looked at the pale-skinned child as if he were a puzzle he could not solve, and that failure alone ignited something dark in him. He forced himself to stand taller, to appear unbothered, yet his voice trembled as he ordered that the child be kept within view, not caged, but never allowed to be invisible, as if hiding him from sight would somehow let the world forget he existed. Men of power often fear the things they cannot explain, and fear, when left unchecked, grows roots that twist into cruelty. The enslaved workers tried to protect him in the only ways they could. When he slept, someone always stayed nearby, not because they saw him as a danger, but because they knew others might. They gave him scraps of stories about the sky and the sea, hoping that even though he was born into chains, his mind could wander somewhere they could not go. They gave him fragments of tenderness in a world that crushed softness like it was weakness. But as the months passed, even they could not ignore the chill that crept into the plantation at night, a coldness that seemed to emanate from nowhere until it touched the bones of anyone who listened too closely. Animals avoided him. Horses, usually gentle and patient, jerked their heads and snorted whenever he was near. Dogs growled low, not out of aggression, but from wariness, as though unsure whether he was made of flesh or something less mortal. Children his age either stood fascinated or refused to look at him at all. He spent most of his early years alone, wandering the edges of the estate under a sun that seemed reluctant to warm him. His mother watched from a distance, unable to hold him often, her own chains pulling her toward fields that demanded her body more than her heart could give. She swallowed every ache that begged her to reach for him. Love, in her world, was a dangerous luxury. They said the boy rarely cried, that his silence was unsettling, as though he listened more than he lived. Some nights, when mist curled across the ground like spirits rising from their sleep, he would stand just beyond the slave quarters, staring toward the great house as if something inside it called to him. No one dared ask what he saw. Children should never stare at darkness that long, but he did. He stood motionless for minutes that felt like hours, his pale skin glowing faintly in the moonlight like a beacon or a warning. When he turned 5, the whispers changed. They no longer simply questioned what he was. They wondered what he would cause. A woman whose child fell ill swore that the sickness began the day she touched his hand. A worker, struck by a falling tree branch, believed the boy had stared at him just hours before, silent and unblinking. Accidents became omens because fear needed something to cling to. The human mind, when frightened, would rather blame the strange than accept the randomness of pain, and on that plantation, pain was plentiful. The master began watching him more closely, studying his movements the way a predator studies prey. He saw the way the workers looked at the boy, some with fear, some with a strange reverence. He felt his own control slipping, the order of his property threatened by a force he could not whip into submission. Power without explanation is a dangerous thing, and danger always seeks a place to unfold. The boy did not understand the weight of the stares that followed him everywhere. He did not understand why his mother's eyes looked wet even when she did not cry. He did not understand why the world around him seemed to breathe differently whenever he moved, why the leaves rustled when there was no wind, why shadows appeared longer when he stood near them. He only knew that he existed, and that his existence was a burden to everyone but himself. The master watched the boy grow like a man watching an unfamiliar animal he did not know whether to fear or tame. At first it was curiosity, a strange fascination that gnawed at him in the quiet hours of dawn when he walked the halls of his estate and tried to silence the lingering question that hovered in his mind. What was this boy? Why did his mere presence make him feel as though the world beneath his feet had begun to tilt? He hated that he could not answer those questions. Men like him lived in a universe where every rule bowed to them, where no voice was allowed to rise unless granted permission. And yet this child, born into chains, without a single word spoken, had already defied him simply by existing. He called for the boy one morning, a demand that echoed across the plantation like a summons from a king. The workers stiffened, their hands tightening around tools, because when the master summoned, someone always suffered. The boy walked toward him with steps too calm for a child his age, his pale skin glowing beneath the sun, his eyes reflecting nothing that resembled fear. The master waved his hand, commanding him to step closer, then lifted his chin with a grip that tried to assert dominance. But the child did not flinch, and in that stillness, something inside the master cracked, the first fracture in a foundation he believed unshakable. He tried to break the boy with tasks meant to crush spirit. He made him stand under the harsh heat for hours, barefoot on stones that burned like coal. He sent him to scrub floors on his knees while others watched, waiting for tears that never came. He even refused him food, thinking hunger would bend him into something soft and compliant. But the child remained, thin yet unyielding, silent yet loud in a way that could not be put into words. His silence became a mirror, and the master hated what he saw staring back at him. As the seasons changed, the plantation began to feel different. Workers whispered of an invisible shift, a weight in the air that pressed down upon them even when the sky was clear and the breeze gentle. Some said the boy brought it, that his presence was a curse, born into flesh. Others believed the master's growing obsession poisoned the soil itself, seeping into everything that breathed upon it. Crops that once rose tall now bowed weakly. Horses stumbled for no reason. The well water tasted metallic, as though touched by blood, though no one had bled near it. The master felt it most, in the deep hours of night when sleep refused to visit. He would lie awake, listening to the wind scrape against his windows like fingernails, and convince himself that he could hear a faint whispering voice just beneath the sound. He tried to ignore it. Men like him could not afford to show fear, even to themselves. Instead, he fed his pride with cruelty, believing dominance could silence the chaos growing inside him. He ordered the boy to work in the fields, though he knew the sun stabbed at his pale skin like needles. He wanted to see him break. He needed it. Because every day that the child continued to stand, untouched by suffering, the master felt smaller, weaker, less in control. And a man whose identity was built on control cannot bear the feeling of slipping power. The boy never fought back. He never raised a hand or a voice. But his presence alone became rebellion. The workers noticed it first. They saw that when he stood beside them, hands buried in rough soil, some injuries healed faster, some aches eased before nightfall. They whispered that maybe he was not cursed, but chosen. Something more than human. Something placed among them for a purpose. These whispers frightened the master more than the boy himself. Hope was more dangerous than curses. Hope could spark defiance. So he isolated the child, He forced him into a storage shed on the far end of the property, a place where shadows collected like dust. He said it was to keep him out of sight, but those who heard the tremor beneath his voice knew better. He was hiding from the truth the boy represented. Yet even from that shed, something about him spread, like a quiet force threading through every corner of the estate. Those who passed by swore they felt eyes upon them, even when they walked alone. Some nights, faint humming drifted through the air though no one was near. The sounds echoed with a tone that was neither joyful nor sorrowful. Something ancient, something the world had forgotten. The master found himself waking with scratches on his arms, though no one had entered his room. He blamed mice, though none were ever found. He discovered objects in his office moved to new places, though no servant would dare touch them. At dinner, his children sometimes stared into nothingness, their pupils growing wide as though seeing something behind their father's shoulder. When he turned, there was nothing there, but their hands trembled as if they had witnessed something too terrible to speak. His wife, who once stood proud and cold at his side, began to break beneath the tension. She said she could hear footsteps in the halls when the house was empty. She said she had nightmares of a pale boy standing at the foot of her bed, staring without blinking. She begged her husband to send him away, to sell him, to silence whatever danger he had brought. The master refused. He told her he would not be controlled by a child. He did not understand that control was already gone. The workers watched from afar, knowing what was coming long before the master ever sensed it. They had seen fear turn to hatred, hatred turn to obsession, and obsession grow teeth. They knew that the moment a man tries to punish what he cannot explain, the world eventually punishes him back. They waited, breath held, as the master spiraled further into the madness he had birthed with his own cruelty. The boy remained silent, his gaze steady, as though he were simply waiting for time to catch up to destiny. And destiny, once set into motion, does not ask permission to arrive. The family that ruled the Wallingford estate had once been seen as untouchable, wrapped in a cloak of wealth and influence that built walls thicker than any bricks or stone. Their faces looked down from portraits in the grand hall, stern and proud, framed by gold that glinted in the candlelight. It was a legacy meant to endure forever, a name carved into ledgers and whispered in town gatherings with both respect and envy. Yet nothing lasts untouched when the ground beneath it begins to rot. And rot does not always begin where the eye expects. Sometimes it starts from the quietest corner, where something small, unnoticed, becomes the thread that slowly unravels everything. The change crept slowly, like a fog rolling in, barely noticed until it was already everywhere. At first, the family dismissed the unease in their home as restless imagination. The mother, who once stood straight-backed, began waking with a tightness in her chest, as though the night itself had pressed on her lungs. She told herself it was only stress, only worry, though she could never name what she was worried about. She tried to busy her hands with chores she never used to touch, arranging flowers, organizing shelves, because when her hands stopped moving, her thoughts grew teeth. The whispers in her mind did not speak in words but in feelings, dread that tasted metallic on her tongue. Her fingers trembled more each day, though she prayed no one noticed. The children changed as well. They were once loud, lively, running through corridors with the recklessness only wealth can afford. Their laughter had filled the home like music, but now silence replaced sound. They sat at the dining table with shoulders curled inward, eyes darting toward corners they never used to notice. The youngest began refusing to sleep alone. She clung to her sister, insisting that shadows followed her across the room even when the lamps were lit. The eldest son, groomed to inherit his father's pride, took to locking his door at night, though he never said why. Some mornings he emerged pale, muttering excuses, rubbing a spot on his neck as though something had gripped him there while he slept. Even their meals changed. Food once enjoyed with indulgence now fell tasteless on their tongues. Sometimes the silverware slipped from their fingers, clattering onto plates with sharp echoes that made them flinch, though no one spoke about the reason they were so easily startled. They began avoiding the grand dining room altogether, choosing smaller corners of the house where their footsteps felt less loud, where the walls did not seem to listen. And then came the dreams. They did not speak of them at first, each believing it was only their own mind betraying them. But dreams that belong to more than one person are no longer dreams. They are warnings, The mother dreamed of a pale figure standing by her window watching her sleep. She did not see his face, only the outline of a body that seemed carved from moonlight. The eldest son dreamed of eyes, wide, unblinking, staring at him from beneath the ground. The youngest daughter dreamed of hands reaching toward her, not to harm, but to cling, as if something was begging to be remembered. And the father, though he would rather die than admit fear, dreamed of a silence so loud it felt like screaming. The house itself responded to the unraveling. Boards creaked, though no footsteps pressed upon them. Doors swayed open without wind. A chandelier, once steady, began to sway in slow arcs, its crystals tinkling like faint chimes. Servants who dared enter the upper room swore the air grew colder the closer they neared the children's chambers. Some claimed they heard faint humming from within the walls, though when they placed their ear to the wood, it fell silent, leaving only their racing heartbeat echoing in the hollow spaces. Still, the master refused to acknowledge that anything was wrong. Denial is the last defense of a man whose world is slipping from his grasp. He sat in his study, surrounded by books and ledgers that once signified order and control, now nothing more than hollow reminders of the life he believed he still held. He ignored the tremor in his wife's voice, the paleness beneath his children's eyes, the unsettling quiet that wrapped the estate like an unseen shroud. His pride convinced him that suffering, as long as it belonged to others, could never touch him. But suffering is patient, it waits, it watches, it learns where to strike so that the foundations shatter all at once. The wife grew ill, her body weakening without cause. She coughed at night, each sound sharp enough to slice through the quiet halls. She tried to hide her handkerchief, stained with something that did not look like blood, yet resembled no illness she had ever known. Some mornings she could not rise from bed, her limbs heavy as if held down by invisible weight. She looked at her reflection in the mirror and saw a stranger staring back, her cheeks hollowing, her eyes dimming, her neck marked by small bruises she did not remember receiving. She stopped speaking of her fears because every word seemed to make them more real. The children began sleepwalking. Their bare feet left prints across the cold floors, leading to windows where they stood as though waiting for someone outside. Some nights they woke in places they could not explain, on staircases, in closets, once even beneath the dining table. They never remembered how they got there. Their father forbade anyone from discussing it, swearing it would stop if ignored. But silence is not a cure. Silence is simply space where the darkness grows. The servants left one by one. They claimed other work, but their eyes betrayed the truth. They were fleeing. Some refused their wages, leaving in the night, driven by instincts older than logic, instincts that told them the house was no longer meant for the living. The estate became quieter, emptier, a shell that echoed with the remnants of a family slowly dissolving. As everything decayed, the boy remained, thin as a shadow, pale as frost, silent as the grave. He did nothing, he said nothing, yet his existence pulsed through the air like a heartbeat that did not belong to the living. Some might have believed he caused the ruin, others that he merely revealed what was already broken. But one truth settled on the land like ash. No house can remain strong when fear becomes its foundation. And the Wellingford family, once the pillars of their world, began to fall, not with screams, but with quiet surrender, each breath a thread unraveling from the tapestry of a name that thought it could not be erased. It began as a whisper, soft enough to be mistaken for imagination, yet heavy enough to sit in the air like a warning. The workers in the quarters were the first to notice that the whispers always came when the boy was near, though they could never tell if the sound came from his lips or from something that followed him unseen. Some swore the whisper was a child's voice. Others insisted it was older, ancient, like wind trapped beneath the earth. They tried to ignore it because acknowledging fear often gives it power, but fear does not need permission to grow. It feeds on silence, on glances exchanged when no one wants to speak the truth aloud. Rumors took shape in the darkest corners of the night. They spoke of eyes glowing under moonlight, of shadows bending toward the boy rather than away, of wounds healed by his presence and illnesses that took root when he was removed. They said he was not cursed, but the curse itself, a force placed among them neither by accident nor by mercy. They said he was the result of something that should have never crossed into the world of the living. Yet even while they feared him, they looked to him because the world offered them no other hope. And in places where suffering is the soil beneath every footstep, people hold on to hope even when it burns their hands. Superstitions thickened like smoke. A woman carried a scrap of cloth that had touched the boy's hand, believing it could ward off death. Another left offerings near the shed where he slept. Cornbread, a shard of wood shaped like a cross, a lock of her own hair, each a tribute to something she did not understand but dared not disrespect. A man who had once mocked the whispers now woke screaming, claiming he saw pale fingers clawing their way up through the dirt near his feet. He left the plantation the next morning, walking into the woods with no destination, and never returned. His absence only strengthened the beliefs. The whispers grew louder when the family in the big house began to crumble. The workers watched from a distance, not out of cruelty, but because distance was the only safety left. They saw the master pacing the balcony at night with frantic eyes, a man stripped of the illusion of control, muttering words that tangled in his throat. They saw the children wandering in circles on the lawn, their fingers twitching as though pulled by invisible strings. They saw the wife pressing her trembling palms against the windows, staring toward the quarters as though begging for salvation she could never ask for aloud. Fear turned into prophecy. Some claimed the boy was sent to destroy the family, to balance the scales in a world weighed down by injustice. Others claimed the family was already doomed long before his birth, and he merely revealed the rot beneath their gold. A few believed he was born of a spirit, a force summoned by suffering too great for the world to hold. But one belief began to overshadow all others, the idea that no one could harm him. That no matter what the master did, no matter how much cruelty was inflicted, something invisible shielded the boy, as though the world itself bent to protect him. That belief frightened the workers more than any curse, because power, even silent power, has a cost. One evening, when the sky bruised purple behind the tree line, a woman from the quarters spoke aloud what many were already thinking. She said that every breath the boy took seemed to draw another piece of life away from the Wellenford family. She said a life like his could not exist in balance with theirs. She said fate was choosing, and fate had made its decision. Her voice carried through the crowd like a sudden gust, leaving a hush so sharp it felt like a blade. No one challenged her. They did not need to. The truth, whatever shape it took, was already unfolding. They began watching the boy not with judgment, but with reverence. They noticed how the air stilled when he stepped outside, how the wind paused as if waiting for permission to move. They noticed how animals that feared him from afar dared to come closer when the moon rose, their instincts shifting beneath nightfall. They noticed how the ground beneath his feet never turned to mud, even after storms, as though the earth refused to swallow his imprint. And slowly, those who once feared him began to kneel, not out of worship, but out of surrender to something that could no longer be denied. The whispers eventually found a voice. They said that history would not remember the Wellenford name, but it would not forget the pale child. They said the family would vanish like dust in wind, but the boy would remain, a story told by tongues trembling in the dark, a reminder that power does not always shout. It sometimes stands silent, waiting. They said he did not belong to them nor to the world that tried to own him. They said he belonged to whatever lies between life and death, breath and silence, dawn and the final hour before sunrise. The master tried to silence the rumors by force, believing that punishment could erase belief. He tore down the shed where the boy slept, thinking walls controlled destiny. He forbade gatherings, believing silence would choke the stories. He threatened anyone who dared speak the child's name, convinced that if it was not spoken, it would cease to exist. But the more he tried to erase, the deeper the story rooted. Because stories born in suffering do not die, they become part of the soil, part of the breath, part of the memory that refuses to leave. In the end, the workers no longer spoke to each other about the boy. They did not need to. The truth no longer required words. It lived in their eyes, in the way they flinched when the master stood near the child, in the way they crossed themselves at night, in the way they taught their children never to stare at the moon too long, lest something stare back. Something had been set in motion the moment the boy first breathed, something that did not care about wealth or bloodline or legacy. The workers knew they were witnessing more than suffering, more than decay. They were witnessing fate, slow and merciless, carving its path through a world that believed it could control everything. And fate, once awakened, never asks permission to finish what it begins. By the time the year reached its final stretch, the estate had sunk into a silence so thick it seemed to muffle even the heartbeat of the land itself. Trees that once swayed with life now stood still, their leaves limp as though drained of color and breath. The river behind the fields, once a source of laughter and stolen moments of freedom for the workers, now crawled slow and murky, reflecting a sky that never looked fully blue anymore. It was as though the world around the Wellandford property had begun to dim, mirroring the fading lives within the grand house, and beneath that dimness, an unspoken truth grew like a vine wrapping itself around every brick, every window, every soul. What was happening could no longer be stopped. The first death came quietly. The youngest daughter, once full of giggles and ribbons, simply did not wake one morning. Her body lay cold beneath the blankets, her small hands curled near her chest, as though she had clutched something no one else could see. There were no signs of harm, no illness, no injury. It was as though life had been taken from her with the same ease as a candle snuffed between two fingers. The mother's screams shattered the stillness at dawn, a raw, agonized cry that echoed beyond the house walls and reached the fields where workers froze at the sound. No one moved, because deep down, they all knew this was the first thread breaking, and many more would follow. The family buried her under the willow tree near the edge of the property, a place once chosen for beauty but now haunted by grief. The boy stood at a distance, watching. His pale skin caught the faint sunlight, making him look like a ghost among the living. Some of the workers watched him instead of the grave because they believed the truth lay in his expression. But his face held nothing. No sorrow, no fear, no reaction. His stillness was its own kind of answer, one no one wanted to admit. The master grew frantic, not outwardly, for pride would never allow such display, but inside a storm was building. He replayed every moment, searching for logic where none lived. He told himself children die, sickness comes, God tests. But his eyes would always drift to the boy when those excuses formed, as though he knew where his blame belonged. He stopped sleeping alone, pacing the halls until sunrise, stopping only when exhaustion forced him into a restless, tortured doze. His dreams became filled with dirt, burying him alive, hands clawing at his skin, whispers inside his skull. He woke often, clawing at his throat as though someone had wrapped invisible fingers around it. Weeks later, the second child fell victim. The eldest son, once the heir to the Wellandford name, collapsed in the library while trying to write at his father's desk. His body was found slumped over papers, his face twisted not in fear, but in confusion, like someone who had seen an answer too late. A thin line of blood trickled from his ear, and though his hand reached toward the door, he never made it. The master refused to bury him on the property, as though sending the body elsewhere might remove the curse. But curses do not cling to corpses, they cling to the living. The wife began wasting away shortly after. She stopped rising from bed and ate only when forced. Her eyes, once sharp and cold, now stared at nothing, unfocused, as though her mind was somewhere her body could not follow. At night, she whispered words that made no sense, strings of sounds that belonged to neither prayer nor language. Sometimes her whispers matched the voice the workers had claimed to hear near the boy. Sometimes she gasped suddenly, pressing her hands against her chest, insisting she saw the pale child standing beside her though he was nowhere near the room. She died on a morning without warning, her body frozen as though time itself had forgotten to let her move again. 3 graves now sat beneath the willow tree. The workers avoided that part of the land entirely, offering it space the way one gives space to a sleeping predator. The master stood alone at the burials, his rage and despair trapped behind clenched teeth. He blamed the boy openly now. He spoke it aloud, finally giving voice to the fear that had poisoned him from the inside. He swore the child was the reason his world had turned to ash. He swore the boy was death itself wearing skin, walking freely among them while taking whatever it chose. He made his final decision on a night with no moon. Lantern in hand, he marched toward the shed where the boy stayed, each step sinking heavy into the earth as though the ground tried to hold him back. The workers awoke one by one, watching through cracks in wood and slits in cloth, silent witnesses to a moment fate had been writing long before any of them were born. No one stopped him. Fear roots the feet, and prophecy ties the tongue. The master threw open the shed door, expecting to find the child asleep. But instead, he found him awake, standing, waiting, as though he already knew. The boy's eyes reflected the lantern flame, but held no emotion. The master lifted his arm, ready to strike, ready to erase the thing he believed had destroyed his bloodline. But something happened in that moment, something that would never be spoken in truth, only in whispers carried through generations. He froze because the boy stepped forward, not fast, not aggressive, but simply stepped, and the master stumbled back as though pushed by a force he could not name. His lantern dropped, shattering, fire licking at the floorboards. The flames spread quickly, greedy, hungry, as though they too had been waiting. The master turned to flee, but his foot caught on nothing, his body falling hard, his breath stolen from his lungs. He reached out, fingers brushing dirt, but never rose again. No one put out the fire, no one dared. They watched as the shed burned, as sparks spiraled upward like souls escaping, as the flames reflected in the boy's unblinking eyes. When dawn came, the ashes cooled, and where the shed once stood, there was nothing. No wood, no remains, no body. The boy was gone, as though he had never existed at all. The Wellenford family name died that night. The house stood empty, slowly collapsing under the weight of time, vines crawling across its walls like fingers reclaiming what was stolen, and the workers who once labored under its shadow left, carrying the story with them. Some said the boy was taken by spirits. Some believed he walked into the woods and still wanders there. But all agreed on one thing. Whatever he was, he did not come to suffer. He came to end something. And he did.